Every predator the Iranai Compact had ever catalogued hunted alone, or in a pack built purely for efficiency, strength, and numbers, nothing more sentimental than that. 400 years of survey data across 11 conquered worlds had never once turned up a species that gathered for any reason a compact analyst would recognize as personal. That changed in the warm, cloudy water off a small island in the South Pacific, where a species that had been swimming the planet's coastlines for longer than most of Earth's mountain ranges had existed turned out to have a habit nobody in orbit had thought to check for. They like spending time with family. This is the story of how that single, unremarkable fact, the kind of detail that shows up in a research paper nobody outside a university library ever reads, ended up rewriting the Iranai Compact's entire approach to underwater reconnaissance. Stick around, because the last entry in this one is going to explain exactly why every compact survey manual printed after this incident now includes a section titled, without irony, "Do not assume it's alone." The patient correction had not technically been supposed to return to Earth's orbit at all. After the incident in the Amazon basin, an incident fleet surveyor Keseth Var had spent 2 months trying to get expunged from his personnel file. With limited success, Regional Command had quietly reassigned him to a secondary survey division, the kind of posting given to officers who were competent enough to keep, but not trusted enough to lead a landing again. His new commanding officer, Fleet Overseer Tom Areth, had reviewed the Amazon incident report exactly once, decided that land-based reconnaissance on this particular planet was clearly cursed, and issued new standing orders that Keseth had found, initially, almost insultingly simple. "We are not landing anywhere with trees," Reth said during the mission briefing aboard her flagship, the Considered Withdrawal. "We are not landing anywhere with grass. We are going to survey water. Water is empty. Water is uniform. Water does not have, and I want this specifically logged in the mission parameters, canopy." Keseth, still carrying the particular caution of a man who had watched a bird disable compact field armor, did not argue. "Target zone," Reth continued, bringing up a chart of the South Pacific, "is a reef system off a small island chain designated locally as Fiji. Population centers are minimal, no industrial infrastructure, no military presence beyond a small Coast Guard detachment. Thermal survey shows a research station on the coast and negligible human activity in the target waters themselves." "What's in the target waters?" Reth checked the survey notes, and for the first time in the briefing her confidence wavered very slightly. "A marine reserve," she said. "A protected reef. According to local records, it exists specifically because the area has an unusually high concentration of large predatory fish." Keseth felt something in his chest that 11 years of service had taught him to recognize as professional dread. "What kind of predatory fish?" "Sharks," Reth said. "Specifically, and I want to be clear, I am reading this directly from the survey file, bull sharks." "Is that significant?" According to the file, they're considered one of the most dangerous shark species on the planet, tolerant of both salt and fresh water, capable of swimming hundreds of kilometers up rivers, and responsible for more confirmed encounters with humans in shallow water than almost any other species. Reth paused. "The reserve exists because local researchers have spent over a decade studying a resident population that returns to this exact reef year after year, for reasons nobody entirely understands." Keseth looked at the chart for a long moment, then back at Reth. "Overseer, with respect. After the Amazon, are we entirely certain that unusually high concentration of large predatory fish in a protected reserve that the locals built specifically because they didn't fully understand it is what you'd call an empty target zone?" Reth's expression did not change, but something in her posture suggested she had in fact had the exact same thought, and had chosen to override it out of sheer professional stubbornness. "It's a fish," she said. "Fish don't have canopy. Deploy the probe." Beneath the surface of Shark Reef Marine Reserve, in water so clear it seemed to hold light rather than simply let it through, Dr. Priya Anand was 30 minutes into a routine tagging dive when her dive computer's proximity sensor chimed with an alert pattern she had never seen it produce before. Priya had spent 6 years with the Fiji Shark Lab, cataloging the resident bull shark population that used this reef as a seasonal gathering ground. And in that time she'd developed the particular hyper-attuned situational awareness of someone who spent a significant fraction of her working life in open water with animals that could, if they chose, to end her afternoon very abruptly. Bull sharks were not, contrary to their reputation, mindlessly aggressive, but they were unpredictable, powerful, and utterly indifferent to a human's assumptions about personal space, and 6 years of fieldwork had taught her to trust her instruments over her instincts, because her instincts had a bad habit of being calm right up until the exact wrong moment. Her computer was not calm. She surfaced, treaded water beside the dive boat, and pulled her mask up to find her research partner, a Fijian marine biologist named Sefa Waka, already scanning the water with a pair of binoculars and an expression she didn't like at all. "Something's off the reef edge," Sefa said, not lowering the binoculars. "Small, metallic, it's not one of ours." "One of our tags." "No, it's moving under its own power, descending." Priya pulled her mask back down and dropped beneath the surface again, following Sefa's pointed direction toward the reef's outer slope, where the coral gave way to a steep drop into deeper blue water, the exact zone where, over 6 years of tagging data, she and her colleagues had documented something genuinely unusual about the reef's resident sharks. Bull sharks, according to most of the existing scientific literature, weren't considered a particularly social species. They weren't schooling fish. They didn't form the tight, coordinated groups seen in some smaller reef species. But Priya's team, working alongside researchers from 2 universities on opposite sides of the world, had spent years accumulating tagging data that suggested something the textbooks hadn't caught up to yet. Alongside the factors you'd expect to matter, sex, age, size, there was another variable quietly nudging the numbers. The sharks spent measurably more time around their own relatives than around unrelated members of the same population. Not constantly, not obviously, but consistently across hundreds of hours of tracking data. Mothers and their offspring, siblings from the same litter, cousins from overlapping generations, drifted back toward each other again and again. In a reef full of unrelated sharks, they could just as easily have spent that time around instead. It wasn't a school, it wasn't a pack. It was something quieter and in its own way considerably stranger, an entire population of one of the ocean's most formidable predators, keeping loose, informal track of who belonged to whom. And descending directly into the middle of that population's core gathering zone, at that exact moment, was a small, blunt, metallic object that smelled, tasted, and moved like absolutely nothing any of them had ever encountered before. Aboard the considered withdrawal, Keseth watched the probe's live feed with the specific attentiveness of a man who had learned, the hard way, not to trust an empty-looking environment. "Report," he said. His analyst, a different, marginally less nervous officer than Pell, reassigned after the Amazon incident to a role command had generously described as administrative, checked the readout. "Probe is descending along the reef slope as planned, thermal signatures picking up." He paused. "A lot of thermal signatures." "Define a lot." 11, no 13, sir, they're converging. On the feed, the water beyond the probe's floodlight cone had begun to change texture. Not with any obvious threat, not at first, just a gathering density of shapes moving in from multiple directions at once. Gray-blue silhouettes with the thick, powerful, unmistakably shark-shaped build that Reth's briefing had, with what Keseth now recognized as significant understatement, flagged as notable. "They're not schooling," the analyst said, watching the pattern. "It's not coordinated in the way a fish school moves. It's, sir, I think they're just all coming to look at the same thing." That, in fact, was exactly what was happening, though neither the analyst nor the probe sensor suite had the frame of reference to understand why. A bull shark's territory in a reserve like this one overlapped constantly with the territories of its relatives, a mother's range bleeding into a daughter's, a pair of half-siblings from different litters circling the same stretch of reef edge on staggered schedules that happened, more often than pure chance would predict, to bring them into each other's company. An unfamiliar object descending into the middle of that overlap zone wasn't just entering one shark's territory. It was entering the shared social space of an entire extended family, and every member of that family who happened to be within range that afternoon had exactly the same reason to come investigate it that a human family might have for gathering around a stranger who'd wandered uninvited into the living room. The largest of the converging shapes, a female the Shark Labs database identified as tag number 114, nicknamed Marama by the research team, easily 3.5 meters long, and according to 6 years of tracking data, the matriarch at the center of one of the reef's largest known related clusters, closed the final distance to the probe in a slow, unhurried arc, and bumped it once hard with her snout. The probe spun, righted itself, and continued its descent. The analyst's console lit up with a fresh proximity alert. "Sir, contact non-damaging, I think it's investigating." "Sharks don't investigate," Keseth said, "sharks hunt." He was, in this specific instance, both correct and about to be proven catastrophically incomplete, in the same way every prior briefing about this planet had been. Priya broke the surface a second time, pulled her regulator out, and shouted across the water at Sefa with the barely contained urgency of someone who had just watched something extraordinary happen 40 feet below and needed, immediately, for someone else to have seen it too. "It's Marama's cluster," she said. The whole group, both of her known offspring from the last 2 seasons, at least 2 of the half-siblings we tagged last year, they're all converging on it. Cepha lowered the binoculars, already reaching for the boat radio. On the object. On the object, Cepha, this is exactly the pattern from the aggregation study. This is family behavior. It had taken the joint Exeter-Fiji Shark Lab Lancaster research team years to build the case, careful season after careful season of tagging, tracking, and statistical modeling, before they'd been confident enough to say it out loud in a paper. That bull sharks, alongside every other factor known to influence which individuals spent time near which, sex, age, body size, all the usual suspects, also showed a measurable, consistent tendency to spend more time around their own relatives than around unrelated sharks sharing the same reef. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of finding that made international headlines on its own. It was the kind of quiet, patient discovery that reshaped, one careful data point at a time, what researchers thought they understood about a species most people only ever thought about as a threat. What Priya was watching now, in real time, was that finding playing out in front of her in a way no dataset could have predicted, because nobody had ever built a probability model for what happens when an entire extended shark family investigates an alien surveillance drone together. How many total? Cepha asked, already radioing the research station. I counted 11 distinct individuals before I surfaced, at least 4 I can identify on site. Priya pulled her mask back down. Cepha, I need the underwater camera rig. Whatever this thing is, we need it on record because nobody at the university is going to believe me otherwise. The probe survived the first 3 contacts. It did not survive the 4th. Marama's eldest tagged offspring, a subadult male the research team's database listed simply as juvenile 114B, roughly 2.5 meters, and per 6 years of behavioral notes, notably more assertive around unfamiliar objects than his mother's more measured investigative approach, made a final, decisive pass at the probe's floodlight housing. Closed his jaws around the casing with the same reflexive test bite a bull shark might apply to any unfamiliar object entering its territory, and crushed it. The feed aboard the considered withdrawal went to static. Keseth stared at the frozen last frame, a wall of gray flank filling the entire camera field, teeth visible at the very edge of the shot for a long moment before speaking. Report, he said very quietly. Probe destroyed, sir, total loss. The analyst's voice had climbed half an octave. Sir, I ran the bite force telemetry before the feed cut. I need to double-check the number because it can't be right. What's the number? Preliminary estimate puts the force at over 5,000 newtons, sir. That's roughly comparable to species we've previously classified as apex predators on far larger, more heavily armored planets. Fleet Overseer Reef, who had entered the bridge in time to catch the last 20 seconds of feed, stared at the frozen frame with the expression of a woman doing very rapid, very unwelcome mental arithmetic. That was one animal, she said. There were 13 in the immediate vicinity when contact was lost, Overseer. 13 animals with that bite force, in a body of water we selected specifically because it had no canopy. Keseth, who had by this point developed something close to a professional specialty in being the officer present for exactly this kind of revelation, allowed himself the smallest, most restrained possible amount of vindication. Overseer, he said, with respect, I believe the operative lesson from the Amazon was not specifically about canopy. Reef turned to look at him. I believe, Keseth continued carefully, the operative lesson was that this planet does not have empty zones. It has zones where we haven't yet found the thing that was never going to show up on a thermal scan. Cepha's radio call brought 2 additional boats out from the research station within the hour, along with a small, quietly incredulous delegation from Fiji's Maritime Safety Authority, who had been alerted the moment Priya's underwater footage, 13 minutes of clear, high-definition video showing an unmistakably artificial object being investigated, bumped, and ultimately destroyed by a coordinated, apparently kinship-clustered group of bull sharks, made its way up the research station's chain of command and directly into the hands of someone whose job description included the phrase, unidentified activity in territorial waters. Lieutenant Commander Marioni Belnaivalu arrived by patrol boat 40 minutes later, watched the footage twice in complete silence, and then turned to Priya with the particular calm of someone whose job had, over the preceding 6 years of quietly circulating international incident reports, prepared her far better for this moment than either of them would have guessed. You're telling me, Marioni said, that this object descended into the reserve and your sharks specifically, a group of related sharks, came to investigate it as a family. That's the pattern, yes. Priya pulled up the tagging data on her tablet, cross-referencing the individuals visible in the footage against 6 years of the Shark Lab's kinship study. Marama, both of her known offspring, 3 half-siblings from an earlier litter we've been tracking since they were juveniles, plus 4 unrelated individuals who appear to have simply followed the group in out of general reef curiosity. It's exactly the aggregation pattern from our published research. Sex, age, and size all factor in, the way they do in most of our sightings, but family ties are consistently part of the picture too. We've documented it for years. We've just never had it demonstrated on something quite this literal before. Marioni watched the final seconds of footage again, juvenile 114B's decisive, almost casual bite, the probe's floodlight flickering out, and allowed herself something close to a smile. For years, she said, people have asked me why we protect this reef so aggressively, why an entire marine reserve exists around a fish most tourists are frankly terrified of. She handed the tablet back to Priya. I think we might finally have found the single best argument anyone's ever going to need. The compact's second attempt did not go better. Reef, unwilling to end her survey mission on the loss of a single unmanned probe, authorized a follow-up deployment 3 days later, this time a manned reconnaissance dive. 2 troopers in pressurized underwater armor, sent down under cover of a moonless night to complete the reef survey the probe had failed to finish. It was, in retrospect, a decision made by an officer who had not yet fully internalized the lesson Kesseth had tried, gently, to offer her on the bridge, and who was about to internalize it considerably less gently instead. Trooper Kalen Voss and Trooper Idris Marn descended into water that felt, on every sensor reading, exactly as empty as the compact's original survey had promised, quiet, warm, uniformly dark beyond the reach of their suit lights, with nothing on thermal or motion detection for the first 11 minutes of the dive. Then the water changed. It wasn't a sound, exactly, nothing their audio pickups registered as a distinct signal. It was a shift in pressure, a subtle change in the water's movement around them that both troopers felt against their suits half a second before their sensors caught up and started screaming. Multiple contacts, Marn said, voice tight. Converging from everywhere, sir, I have no clean vector on this. Above, aboard the considered withdrawal, Reef watched the feed with her jaw set. Identify the individuals. There's no time to identify individuals, Overseer, there are 8 of them. What neither trooper had the frame of reference to understand, what would take Priya's research team another full season of tagging data to formally document, in a follow-up study that would eventually make its way, translated and heavily annotated, into the compact's own permanent survey archive, was that the reef's resident population didn't need to coordinate an attack in any deliberate, tactical sense to respond as a group. They simply needed enough related individuals within range of an unfamiliar disturbance at the same time, and the reef's overlapping kinship territories did the rest, pulling one shark after another into the same patch of water for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the same quiet, persistent instinct that had shown up, data point after data point, across 6 years of careful research. They liked being near their own family and Their own family, on this particular night, had all converged on the exact same unfamiliar disturbance within minutes of each other. Voss and Marn made it back to their extraction point, their pressurized suits did not. By the time the recovery shuttle hauled them up out of the water, both troopers were shaken, uninjured beneath armor that had held barely against repeated test bites from animals whose combined bite force, engineering later confirmed, exceeded anything in the compact's 400-year threat archive by a margin that took 3 separate revisions of the incident report to phrase diplomatically. Overseer, Kesseth said, once the shuttle had docked and the debrief was underway, I would like to formally request that we conclude the survey. Reef, staring at suit camera footage of gray shapes circling from every direction at once, did not argue. The compact's final withdrawal from Fijian waters happened quietly, without the dramatic surrender or diplomatic incident that had marked some of the compact's earlier, more visible failures on this planet. There was no confrontation, no negotiation, no moment of grand realization broadcast across a calm channel for a watching crowd. There was simply a survey vessel that stopped transmitting, a scout ship that quietly broke orbit 2 days later, and a research team on a small island in the South Pacific who would spend the following weeks fielding an increasingly bewildering series of questions from marine biology colleagues around the world, all of whom had somehow gotten hold of 13 minutes of underwater footage that nobody could quite explain the full context of, and all of whom agreed watching it that it was without question the single strangest piece of shark behavior footage any of them had ever seen. Priya's paper, when it was finally published the following year, made careful, deliberate note of exactly what the data could and couldn't support. The aggregation event, she wrote, was consistent with previously documented patterns. Alongside sex, age, and body size, kinship remained a measurable factor in how the reserve's resident bull sharks chose to spend their time, clustering more consistently around relatives than the surrounding unrelated population would predict by chance alone. The specific triggering object, she noted in a single, carefully neutral footnote that the journal's editors had queried twice before allowing it to stand, remains of undetermined origin and is beyond the scope of this study. Fleet Overseer Reth's incident report was considerably less neutral. It sat eventually in the same growing archive as Keseth's Amazon report, cross-referenced under the same broad classification, "Do not underestimate this planet," and appended with a final line that the Compact's Xenobiology division would go on to cite, without irony, in every subsequent survey briefing for any body of water larger than a puddle. Recommendation: strike empty water from all future threat models as a synonym for undefended. Recommendation: any reserve, sanctuary, or protected zone established by the local population around a specific animal should be treated, going forward, as a direct statement of that animal's threat level, not evidence of its absence. Recommendation: the deadliest thing about this planet's oceans may not be any single predator, but the fact that its predators, unlike ours, appear to actually like each other. 2 months later, at a small marine science symposium in Suva, Priya Anand stood in front of a room of visiting researchers and gave a talk that started, as her talks always did, with the finding that made people lean forward in their seats. That bull sharks, contrary to their reputation as solitary, indiscriminately aggressive predators, showed a measurable preference for spending time around their own relatives. A quiet social structure hiding inside one of the ocean's most feared animals, discovered one careful season of tagging data at a time. This time, though, she ended the talk with a question she'd never had cause to ask before, not because she expected a real answer, but because 6 years of research had taught her that the most interesting discoveries always started with someone willing to ask an obvious question nobody else had thought to. "We've spent years learning that these animals recognize family," she said, clicking to her final slide, a still frame of Marama and her offspring, moving together along the reef edge in the soft blue evening light, exactly the way they had 100 times before and exactly the way they would 100 times again. "We built an entire protected reserve around the idea that they're worth defending." She paused, thinking, not for the first time, about 13 minutes of footage that had never fully made sense to anyone outside a very small, very confused circle of researchers, and one Fijian maritime officer who had started keeping a private, unofficial file of inker. "Assingly strange reports. I just think it's worth wondering," she said, "what happens the day something finally shows up that doesn't know that yet." Somewhere 400 light-years away, in an archive that had grown considerably more cautious over the preceding several months, that exact question had already been answered, filed, cross-referenced, and quietly circulated to every survey vessel about to make the same overconfident mistake for the first time. Whatever you think is waiting in the empty water, it probably isn't alone, and it almost certainly has family close enough to notice you before you notice them. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe if you want the next chapter of Earth's strangest, most accidental defense force, and drop a comment telling me which animal you think the aliens should meet next. Because between the birds and the sharks, this planet is starting to look a lot less empty than anyone up there originally thought.